This episode of The Edge is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek.fm at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
You're listening to Trek FM.
What have you done out there on the edge of Federation space?
Welcome everyone to Notes from the Edge, a sub-show of our Star Trek Discovery podcast, The Edge. I'm C Bryan Jones, or Chris, and I'll be your host as we flip through the pages of our notebook. In Notes from the Edge, we'll explore connections between Discovery and the greater Star Trek universe, which includes the prior 6 TV series and 13 films, as well as the massive literary universe, because there are elements from there that are being worked into the series as well. And also we'll delve deeper into some of the ideas that are unique to Discovery. I kick off each episode of Notes with my thoughts on the latest episode of Discovery, which this time means magic to make the sanest man go mad. There weren't many connections to explore in this episode, unlike the previous 6, but I will touch on a few. Altogether, I'll cover 4 main points in this episode: Stella, Anicium and Yurium, music, and time loops, which will be the main focus of the notes section. So let's start off with thoughts about the episode. The reaction I've seen online has typically been gathered at the extremes. Some love it, almost as much as Burnham loves Tyler, except they are better at expressing it than our series lead, and others hate it and have decided to pick apart every element of the story that might be hard to swallow. How did Mudd escape from the Klingon prison ship? How did he capture a Gormagander, an endangered species, get his ship inside the fish? And then find Discovery? How did the Discovery crew find Stella and her dad during a 30-minute period? And on and on. You get the picture. And while these aren't unreasonable questions, such story elements are not uncommon in Star Trek. I feel that those who choose to make this the focus of their magic viewing and who use it to continue tearing down the series do so just because they don't like Discovery and are unwilling to allow anyone else to. Sometimes it feels like, hey, I don't like it, so I'm not going to let you like it either. You know, complaining about storytelling mechanisms that are present in all past Star Trek series as a way to discredit this series really isn't valid criticism. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, it was great when TNG did it in so-and-so episode, or when Voyager did it in so-and-so, but here it just takes me out of the story. That doesn't work. All right, anyway, I'll come back to my place here. Sorry about the mini rant there. I got rolling a little bit. It's just something I've been thinking about this week as I see reactions to magic to make the sanest man go mad, and I'll explain a bit more as I go on. So let's move on. What does magic refer to? I think it refers to multiple things. The most obvious is Mudd's use of a crystal to reset time. It might also refer to how someone on the crew found a recording of Wyclef Jean's We Trying to Stay Alive in the year 2256. But it could also refer to love. Specifically, how Burnham's feelings for Tyler and vice versa are affecting her. She doesn't know how to process them, much less how to act on them, and it is driving her mad. I think this is the secondary meaning of the title, especially if you look at the bookends to the story, her monologue before and after the Mudd stuff. But the primary meaning is the obvious, I think. Harry Mudd's technology and how it drives Stamets mad as he relives the events loop after loop. It could also drive many of the crew members mad if they remembered what happened the last time through, which they don't. So the looping is another thing that I'd like to talk about. The immediate reaction among viewers was to compare this episode with Cause and Effect. Of course it makes sense. Cause and Effect is the most famous episode in which a Starfleet crew finds themselves repeating the same period of time over and over. But I feel that this is a comparison that has gotten a bit out of control, at least as I see things in social media. Out of the control to the point that it has become a contest between The Next Generation and Discovery, which plays right into the hands of the naysayers. In reality, these two episodes have only a basic structure in common. Otherwise, they are very different stories. I'll talk more about that and other instances of time loops later. But as for this story, I thought the time loops were handled very well by the writers. The use of a party as the starting point gave them a lot of flexibility in how to move the characters through the overall progression of the story. We saw how the interactions differed each time and how the information needed to find a solution was shared from loop to loop, despite the fact that only one character had any memory of having experienced the events before. Despite starting at the party, each loop felt different thanks to very smart camera work, writing, and editing. And what I mean by editing is the pace at which we enter and leave the party. You know, they shot more than they actually cut into the episode, and the way that we are shown certain bits and how those bits build momentum for the story, I thought was handled really, really well. I saw a comment somewhere, and I don't remember where, but it was a comment in which it was said that the episode was terrible because they wasted so much time dancing at a party instead of trying to save the ship and captain. Well, when I read that, first I wondered if that viewer was paying attention to what they were watching, because it is at the party and while dancing that much of the solution is formulated. Then I decided to find out just how much time is actually spent at the party during each loop. I became curious, so I watched the episode again, and I timed everything, and here it is. And of course, these are the loops that we see. I'm going to number them in the order we see them, but Mudd mentions in the next to last loop that we see that he has already killed Lorca 53 times. So we don't really know exactly which loops we're seeing. It could be the final 6 loops, or these could be scattered throughout. We don't know. But anyway, of the ones that we see, loop 1, we are at the party for 2 minutes and 7 seconds. And that's actually pretty quick to establish the premise and the event that will be the thread that holds the story together. And then after that, other things happen. Loop 2, we are at the party for 24 seconds. Loop 3, once again, we're there for 24 seconds. Now loop 4, this time we're there longer, 1 minute and 29 seconds. But in this loop, that time is used almost entirely for discussion related to what is happening and finding a solution. Loop 5 is the next to last loop that we see. And this is the longest one. This time in all, we are at the party for 3 minutes and 46 seconds. But after 2 minutes and 50 seconds, we cut to scenes with Mudd. Then we cut back to the party for a moment at the end. Now, the dialogue that we're hearing is taking place at the party the entire time. So that's 3 minutes and 46 seconds. But Tyler is explaining through part of this how Mudd told the story about robbing a Betazoid bank. And we're watching Mudd move around the ship as Tyler explains how Mudd robbed the bank. And this story is critical for establishing how he is controlling the ship and figuring out how to stop him. So by no means is this wasted time. This is the key to the story, right? So then the rest of that plays out. And then in loop 6, which is the final loop that we see, we are at the party for only 7 seconds. And then we jump right back into things. So that's 8 minutes and 17 seconds out of a 47-minute episode. And at least 5 minutes are used for key discussion about the situation and what they need to do to solve it. And additional time is spent on character development. And that last point is kind of important when writing good stories and building a strong television series. So much of this episode is spent on character development, maybe more than you realize the first time that you watch through. We learn a lot about Burnham and Tyler in this episode. For one thing, we learn that Burnham has never been in love. But we also learned that Tyler likes Burnham, and Burnham likes Tyler. In the scene in which they finally, or at least Burnham finally reveals that to Tyler, it's really kind of funny because it's almost like, I was going to say high school, but it's almost like junior high school. But it's also understandable, right? Because of her upbringing on Vulcan, and she's trying to understand these human emotions. I thought it was really cute. And we also learn more about Stamets and Culber and how they met. You know, these are the kinds of things that we learn in Star Trek episodes that end up in the encyclopedia, or especially that end up on sites like Memory Alpha. This is how we learn these things. So can you imagine if you didn't spend the time to have these conversations? By no means is this a waste of screen time. We also see Tilly becoming a more interesting character. I thought Tilly was fantastic in this episode. And you all know how critical I've been of Tilly up until now, although I was warming up to her a bit last week. But this episode, I thought she was fantastic. I'm starting to be able to see her more as a real person and a multifaceted person compared with before, where I was seeing her more as being kind of a one-note character. I know many of you don't agree with me on that, but that's my reading based on, where I am and how I see things. But this episode, she was great. So we're seeing that. And we also get more information about the spore drive and how they are making it work without the tardigrade. I thought this was obvious from last week's episode, but I found out from some discussions online this week that it wasn't. To me, it was very clear in the last episode in Lethe that Stamets has taken the place of the tardigrade, and he is now navigating the ship. He's controlling everything. But then I saw some people who weren't really clear on what was going on. And so here they completely cleared it up by showing this implant that Culber has designed for him. So that's something else that we get. And I could go on, but the point is that this episode is packed with character development, despite the fast-paced adventure of stopping mud. I remember after I watched this episode the first time and I tweeted that I had watched it, I think someone asked me what I thought about it, and my response was that I've got to watch it again before I make any comments about it because they packed so much into 47 minutes that, of course, I followed the story, but I also knew that there was all kinds of stuff in there that I probably hadn't absorbed yet, and it was better if I just didn't comment on what my thoughts were at that time. So this is a packed episode. Now, while we're talking about the party, I do want to mention one other criticism that I heard, and this one I thought was kind of funny. I saw someone say that it was cheesy that there were disco lights on the ship because you have that shot from space and you see the ship and you see the colorful disco lights. Those were lights from the party showing through the window. The ship is in space and it's dark, right? I mean, what should we expect here? I didn't understand this. And those lights were a perfect visual cue to start each time loop. So I thought it was fun. I thought it helped the story move along. And just physically, it made sense, right? If the ship is in dark space and there's something going on colorful inside the windows and lots of light, of course you're going to see it from the outside. I mean, that's how windows work. So there you go. So what else do I have for you in the thoughts section today? I'm not going to break down the episode in detail because that has already been done here on The Edge, and I don't want to just repeat things. And maybe we'll eventually do it on the Ready Room in a future loop. I'll just say that this was one of the most Star Trek episodes so far. And I use that term not because I feel that the first 6 episodes weren't, but because there has been so much debate about whether Discovery is Star Trek. And I think that if you watch this episode and you still argue that point, that Discovery is not Star Trek, then I think you have to negate most of the previous 743 stories. Magic is a nice hybrid between the Next Generation and the original series. It borrows the concept of cause and effect, and it marries it with what I feel is a very TOS resolution. I remember tweeting that right after I watched it. And I didn't say that because it involves TOS characters in Stella and Mudd, but because it just feels like one of the ways that Kirk and his crew would outsmart their adversary, all the way down to the solution being quite obvious to the viewer while catching the antagonist by surprise. Surely no one watching this episode didn't realize that it was Stella, not the Klingons, who were being held in the final loop. And I think I probably tweeted that because the ending feels very original series for me. Even though earlier parts of the episode made me feel more TNG, Voyager. It all fits together really well. And to that point, along the way, we get a mission to stop an intruder that would be right at home on any past Star Trek series. Magic to make the sanest man go mad is just pure fun. And yes, there are holes in the writing. And yes, I saw the holes. I'm not blind. But there are holes in the writing of many episodes across the entire Star Trek franchise. And we love those stories anyway. So why should this one be different? All right, let's move on to notes. Oh wait, one more thing. This is really important, so please listen carefully. Technically, a Gormagander is not a fish. Okay, now let's move on to notes. I should probably start with the most obvious connection, Stella. Stella Mudd, or now Stella Grimes, but there actually isn't anything to talk about here. Of course, there is the speech about Stella that Mudd gives in the episode I, Mudd, and I'm not going to repeat it here. You've probably heard it before. And that speech is the basis for everything we have heard in Discovery about why Mudd has fled into space and was captured by the Klingons. And there is also the android version of her that he created, which we see in that episode. But that's it. Stella doesn't appear and isn't mentioned in any other episodes, and she doesn't appear in books either, outside of the novelization of I, Mudd, which was part of the 1978 Bantam paperback, Mudd's Angels by J.A. Lawrence. And J.A. Lawrence was actually James Blish's wife. The J.A. stands for Judith Ann. And Baron Grimes is new, which is why I said now Stella Grimes. So instead of talking about Stella, I'll start with 2 substances, Anicium and Yurium. This is what Mudd combines to create the explosive he uses to destroy the ship each time and reset the time loop. This is a reference to the Next Generation. In the 4th season episode Night Terrors, the Enterprise D is caught in an anomaly called a Tychon's Rift. It's named for the first person to encounter it, at least the first reported encounter, a Malthusian freighter captain called Bella Tychon. To break free, Tychon used a combination of Anicium and Yurium to create a massive explosion that caused a rupture in the rift through which his ship was able to escape. Yurium was mentioned twice before this in the 2nd season episode, everyone's favorite 2nd season episode, in fact, the Royale. When the Enterprise scans the atmosphere of Theta 8, it is discovered that 2% of the atmosphere is Yurium. And in the 3rd season episode, Hollow Pursuits, it is revealed that Troy, the goddess of empathy, uses a Yurium-based hair product to style her ethereal locks. No, I'm just kidding about that. But it is mentioned in that episode that the radioisotope Jacmanite 632 can be created artificially from the decay of high-energy Yurium. But don't tell anyone. Or we'll get a breaking news story about the next generation's enormous science blunder. Last time I checked, Jackmanite 632 isn't real. Shh. All right, next up is music. There's been talk this week about how wonderful it is that some music other than jazz and classical survived into the 23rd century. I find it interesting how literal some fans interpret what we see on screen. I've mentioned before how the canon police assume that if something was never shown on screen, then it cannot exist, and this applies to music. The reason we always hear classical and jazz on Star Trek is that it can be used, or the compositions and performances that they choose can be used, without paying royalties. In Discovery, we have a series for which the studio is willing to spend the necessary money to use more recent music. So we get Wyclef Jean's We Trying to Stay Alive from 1997's Carnival, which was Wyclef's first solo album. And disco aside, it's the perfect song title to describe what our crew is doing in this story. They are literally trying to stay alive. We also get Al Green's Love and Happiness from the year I was born, 1972, a track from his album I'm Still in Love with You, which is actually quite fitting for Burnham and Tyler as they dance and share their feelings on what is at least the 54th time they met up at this party. Speaking of music and numbers, when Mudd said that there are 823 ways to die in space, do you know what I heard in my head? Well, of course, it was Paul Simon's 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, only with lyrics such as weaponized dark matter, which is something Paul Simon never thought about. William Shatner's You'll Have Time from his excellent 2004 album Has Been, which was produced by Ben Folds, also came to mind. That song lists ways that you can die. One of them includes a spider bite, so it's done in a humorous way. Also, the use of, and this is just me probably, but the use of a variation of the Bee Gees' Stayin' Alive immediately reminded me of a moment in the BBC Radio 4 version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's the radio drama version. And specifically the secondary phase, when in Fit the Eighth, or the 8th chapter, Zaphod and Roosta go to a discotheque to escape the attacking Frog Star fighters.
Hey, Rooster, I've just had this really hoopy idea. We're in this wrecked building, right?
Right.
And the building's in this really amazing force bubble, right?
Right.
And the force bubble's flying through interstellar space, right?
Right.
And there are 7 Frog Star fighters towing us at about hyperspeed 12 to the Frog Star, right?
It had better be a good idea, Beeblebrox.
Oh, it's a smash! You want to hear it?
Okay.
Let's go to a discotheque.
Are you crazy?
What's the matter? Don't you like discotheques? Look, I got this free invite some cat was giving out in the street. Here it is.
Wormhole Disco. Loudest noise on Beetlejuice. Free body debit for one night only. It had better be a good disco.
Listen, if it was a good disco, they wouldn't have to give away body debit cards. Right, Rooster, we are going to groove our way out of here. We did it!
What did you say?
I said we did it!
What's it done?
No! Do I look like I want to dance?
You look like it to me.
I must have got my wrong body on.
Suit yourself then. Hi there, baby. You want to dance?
Beeblebrox? All these dancers, they're robots.
They're just to make the place look crowded, give it some atmosphere.
But there aren't any real people here at all.
Pretty groovy, right? Sorry, Stamets is really having an effect on me. Okay, time to go down a rabbit hole, actually, which we always do in the Ready Room, but I didn't know I could do it on a solo podcast. But as I got to thinking about this, I found this very interesting, since we're talking about music. In the version of Stayin' Alive that you just heard from the Hitchhiker's Guide, they turned the Bee Gees' original into space music by changing the time signature from 4/4 to 7/4 by cutting out one note every 2 bars. That wasn't enough, though, to make it really out of this world, so they then played that version backwards. And then, to create the impression that the discotheque was deafeningly loud, but of course not to blast your ears as you're listening to the radio drama, they played this music in one room, but recorded it from another. And then they used that in the radio drama. And I just find that really fascinating as a musician and a creative professional. And also, if you're not a musician and you're wondering, like, what's the difference between 4/4 time and 7/4 time? So 4/4, I'm sure you understand, but 7/4 might seem a little bit odd. I would say probably the song that you'll know, the most famous pop or rock song that's in 7/4 time is probably Pink Floyd's Money. So go listen to Money by Pink Floyd, and that's 7/4 time. All right, let's get back to Star Trek. So in addition to these two songs, Wyclef Jean and Al Green, we also got the obligatory classical music in this episode. And the piece that we got is from one of my favorite composers, Richard Wagner. It's the introduction to Act 3 of Lohengrin. And I think it was used brilliantly in the bridge scene with Mud. For me, it added so much to that scene. And when he left the bridge and the way they ended it, I thought it was brilliant. Some of you may know that I am a musician, and I played bass trombone in a professional orchestra for 7 years before embarking on my career in media. So I'm actually trained in classical music. And as a bass trombonist, Wagner is, for me, what would the Bajorans call him? A prophet. I do love Wagner. So when else have we heard popular music in Star Trek? It hasn't happened so often, especially not on TV, but in the movies, of course, recently, in the 2009 J.J. Abrams film, we heard Sabotage by the Beastie Boys. And we hear that again in the climax of Star Trek Beyond. In Star Trek Into Darkness, Kirk plays the Beastie Boys, Body Movin', in his apartment. And Fight the Power by Public Enemy was played aboard the Franklin in Star Trek Beyond. I'm sure you remember that too. Long before this on the big screen, Steppenwolf's Magic Carpet Ride and Roy Orbison's Ooby Dooby were heard in Star Trek First Contact. And in fact, if that Steppenwolf disc hadn't been on hand, we may have never made first contact with the Vulcans, and we might all be Borg drones. So music is important. Going back to television and excluding all the jazz standards sung by Vic Fontaine, Hey Joe by the Jimi Hendrix Experience can be heard in DS9's Past Tense Part 2. And that's all I can think of. Sorry to build up your expectations there. TV episodes are made on a tight budget, so there really isn't anything else to talk about. But it's really nice to see them using some more current music on Discovery. I think it helps make the world in which our characters live feel more real. And it would be very surprising if people weren't still listening to music from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on 200 years from now. We listen to music and read stories from 200, 300 years ago, and even longer. Let's not fall into the trap of assuming that everything that exists and could exist, everything that is part of life in the Star Trek universe, has already been shown on screen, or even that it must be shown on screen at all. Just because we haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not there. And maybe, just maybe, Harry Mudd's ultimate fate on Discovery is to be rickrolled by Tilly. All right, boy, I talk a lot, don't I? Sorry about that. Let's move on to one more thing, time loops. As I mentioned earlier, the narrative after Magic aired quickly became, which did it better, Magic or Cause and Effect? But these are really different stories, and Cause and Effect isn't the only time Star Trek has done the temporal loop thing. It's just the one everyone thinks about, because it's the most prominent. There are, of course, a lot of stories with time weirdness going on, but if we stick just to temporal loops, there are two others that come to mind. One is on Voyager, the third season episode Coda. Now, you might remember this one. This is where Chakotay thinks that Janeway has died. This is a bit different, though, because it was really a case of an alien creating the illusion of temporal loops in the mind of a dying Janeway in hopes of convincing her to let go of life. But from the viewer's perspective, for most of the episode, we believe that Janeway and Chakotay are caught in a temporal loop. So that's one other case, but I think Coda, since people are talking about who did it better, I think Coda suffers from a very lazy implementation of this idea. Now, perhaps I perceive it more that way now than when it aired in 1997, but there's a feeling that the writer, who was Jerry Taylor in this case, knows that we'll remember cause and effect because it hadn't been so long since that episode, and we would understand what a temporal causality loop is. And so she really makes no effort at all to build it up. Janeway and Chakotay immediately realize they are caught in a loop the first time we see it repeat, and every time after. So it really isn't very interesting at all. Then again, if I were to argue the other side, because I do like to see multiple sides of everything, I would say that the reason that it is so easy for them to remember is because they're not actually in a temporal causality loop. It's just the alien trying to rush her through the process. It isn't real. So there really isn't any figuring it out to go on. Sticking with Voyager, there is a reference to a time loop in Q2, actually. But it's just in passing. When Q's son tells Janeway that he has placed the rest of the Voyager crew in a temporal loop so that he could talk to her in private, the crew is repeating the same 30 seconds over and over. But it's not the point of the episode, and we don't see it, but it is mentioned. There's also a temporal loop on Enterprise. In future tense, Trip and Malcolm experience the same 30 seconds over and over due to radiation leaking from the 31st century ship. So those are two other cases, but as full episodes go, Cause and Effect and Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad are the only two examples. Therefore, pitting them head-to-head makes sense, right? Well, not really. It does on a basic level, but for me, it's comparing apples and oranges. If you ask me, which is the better time loop story, my answer would be that they are both great, but they are different types of stories, so I can't choose one over the other, and I wouldn't even rank them. Sure, they share the mechanism of a set period of time repeating over and over, but cause and effect is a mystery that the crew must solve, whereas magic is a problem that the crew must overcome. With the former, we have a scientific mystery that they have just stumbled into. With the latter, we have an intruder with a vendetta against the captain who must be stopped. Yes, they are similar in that everyone will die if they don't get out of the time loop, but they aren't the same story at all. One big difference is that in Cause and Effect, many crew members begin having memories of past loops. That's how they realize that they're in a temporal causality loop in the first place. They figure out collectively that they are trapped in a temporal causality loop, and they figure out what caused it and what they must do to avoid it. Their challenge is figuring out how to tell themselves what to do, how to pass along the solution. In Magic, no one other than Stamets has any memory of past loops, and he has complete memory, something that no one aboard the Enterprise had. And he only remembers everything that has happened because he now exists outside the normal time flow. We didn't have any mechanism like that in Cause and Effect. Even Data. Some people have said that Stamets plays the Data role in this story. Well, that's not true. Stamets doesn't play the Data role. We were able to implant something that Data could recognize, but Data didn't remember everything that had happened in every previous loop. So it is up to Stamets in Magic to explain everything each time and guide his crewmates toward a solution, which is why he looks so exhausted by the end. Both have interesting things that happen over and over, of course, and my favorite thing in Cause and Effect is Beverly's wine glass. It breaks every time, but we see or hear it in a different way. They get really creative. At one point we don't even see it fall. We just hear it over the comm system. In Magic, a similar thing might be Saru telling Lorca that a whale is not a fish. Although again, this doesn't contribute in any way to the solution, nor is it a clue. Beverly's glass, on the other hand, is a memory trigger for her each time it breaks, so it plays an integral part in the story. So ultimately, one is a mystery, while the other is an adventure story. I like them both very much. I just don't think the two can be pitted head to head just because they both involve a time loop. Cause and Effect is one of my all-time favorite episodes of any Star Trek, and I don't feel slighted in the least by a similar story structure being used on Discovery. It's great fun and is done really well. Now, if you're one to get hung up on every little detail and story element that can't be explained in a completely realistic way, then yeah, this might be magic to make the whiniest fan go mad to you. But if you've listened all the way to the end of this podcast, that's probably not you. If you just go with the flow and remember that this is supposed to be entertainment, I think they did a fantastic job. And Rainn Wilson as Harry Mudd is really delightful. I think he's doing a great job. All right, so those are the notes from the Edge for this week, for week 7 of Star Trek Discovery. Be sure to check out our Discovery coverage throughout the week on Monday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Brandy and Bruce go live on YouTube with Live from the Edge, and they share their initial reactions to watching the episode. You can take part in the show by interacting with them on Twitter or through chat, and if you can't join live, don't worry. You can still listen to the show on Tuesday morning when it is released as a podcast. Commentary tracks will be available each Wednesday as Tracks from the Edge, and we'll discuss your feedback on Postcards from the Edge on Thursdays. And of course, you can catch full analysis, normal Trek FM style, on the Edge main show on Friday. I'll be wrapping things up each week here on Notes from the Edge on Saturdays or Sundays, and going into this kind of deep dive into the links between Discovery and the broader franchise, and usually there are more links than there were in this episode. You'll find all of these in the main feed for the Edge and in the Trek FM master feed. And if you don't know what the master feed is, by the way, it contains every episode of every show that we do, and sometimes some special things that aren't available anywhere else. So it's a great way to keep up with everything happening on the network, and a great way to sample other shows before you subscribe to their dedicated feeds. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Discovery and the things I talked about today in Notes from the Edge and the things about this episode, Magic, to make the sanest man go mad. The best place to do that is in the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook, where Amy Nelson will collect your feedback for Postcards from the Edge. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. And just click Join, and we'll let you in. It is a closed group. You can also find us on Twitter. Our username is TrekFM, or send us email using the contact form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and choose the Edge, and that'll come to all of our hosts by email. And if you'd like to find me personally, you can find me there in the Babel Conference, of course, but perhaps the best place to converse with me is on Twitter. That's where I'm most active. My username is C Bryan Jones, the letter C and Bryan with a Y, and that's my name pretty much everywhere in social media. If you'd like to hear me discuss Star Trek beyond Discovery, you can catch my main show, The Ready Room, and I also co-host The Orb, our Deep Space Nine podcast with Matthew Rushing. You'll also hear me on lots of older episodes if you go way back in the catalog from various shows, because I used to host 7 shows every week. And you can find my writing about Star Trek on the official website at startrek.com. I'd like to take a moment and thank our associate producers of The Edge, Norman C. Lau, Tony Robinson, Lisa Slack, Tom Puleo, Shoaib Mirza, and Richard Rutledge. Thank you so much, guys, for your support. I really appreciate it. We had a record month in October. We transferred 9.8 terabytes of podcasts to our listeners, and so I'm going to be getting a big bill for that. So any support that you can provide, it always helps us out. So if you want to help us keep our shows coming, please do visit patreon.com/trekfm to find out how. You can become an associate producer or join the Patrons Roundtable and talk Star Trek with fellow listeners and some of our hosts. Get access to Patron Zone, our special website for patrons. We have all kinds of perks for you, and you can find out everything that you need to know at patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm, and I really do appreciate all of your support. Thank you so much. Well, that's all I have for you this time. Thank you so much for listening to my rambling and one mini rant. And join me again next time as we jot down more notes right on the paper's edge.